Long before the age of heroes, when the world was still young and the boundaries between gods and mortals remained thin as morning mist, there existed a darkness at the edge of the known world. Beyond the pillars that marked the end of civilization, beyond the waters where sailors dared not venture, dwelt creatures born from the union of ancient forces that predated even the Olympians themselves. The primordial seas had churned with power since before Zeus had overthrown his father, since before the Titans had walked the earth, since before the first ray of sunlight had pierced the eternal darkness. And from those ancient waters had emerged beings of terrible beauty and beautiful terror, creatures whose very existence defied the natural order that the younger gods would one day impose upon creation. These were beings that mortal tongues struggled to name, that mortal minds struggled to comprehend, that mortal hearts could not help but fear. Phorcys was one such being. He was called the Old Man of the Sea, though he was older than any man had ever been or ever would be. His domain was the hidden depths, the places where light could not reach and pressure crushed all mortal things to dust. His eyes had witnessed the birth of the first stars and the death of beings whose names had been forgotten before humanity took its first steps upon the earth. He moved through the deepest trenches like a shadow through darkness, commanding currents and creatures that the surface dwellers would never see and could never imagine. He had taken as his bride Sato, goddess of sea monsters and the dangers that lurked beneath the waves. She was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, terrifying in the way that the abyss is terrifying, magnificent in the way that only forces of nature can be magnificent. Her children would become the nightmares that haunted sailors across every sea. Their union was one of darkness embracing darkness, of depth calling to depth, of power meeting power in the places where no light could follow. From it emerged offspring that would haunt the dreams of humanity for millennia to come. Among their children were the Grey, three sisters who had been born old. Their hair grey from the first moment of their existence, their bodies withered before they had ever known youth. They shared a single eye and a single tooth between them, passing these treasures from hand to withered hand in eternal rotation, each sister taking her turn to gaze upon the world and to chew the food that sustained their immortal flesh. They dwelt in a land of perpetual twilight, far from the warmth of the sun, far from the company of gods or mortals, forever watching and waiting for purposes only they understood. Their prophecies were feared throughout the ancient world, for they saw things that even the Olympians could not perceive, truths that even Zeus dared not hear spoken aloud. But Phorcys and Ceto had also produced three other daughters. These would become far more terrible in the memory of mortals than the Grey could ever be. They were called the Gorgons, and their name would echo through the ages as a byword for horror incarnate. The word itself derived from a term meaning terrible or dreadful, and terrible they were, dreadful beyond the capacity of mortal imagination to conceive. Their mere existence was a warning against the hubris of those who believed they understood the limits of the possible. Stheno was the eldest, her name meaning the mighty one, and her immortal flesh could never be pierced by any weapon forged by God or man. Her wings were gold, burnished like the shields of 1,000 armies marching to war. Her hands were bronze, capable of crushing stone as easily as a child crushes sand between curious fingers. Her face was a mask of such hideous malevolence that even the gods themselves averted their eyes when she passed, for to gaze upon her was to know fear in its purest and most primal form. She had existed since the dawn of creation, and she would exist until its final twilight. Euryale came second, the wide-stepping one, whose scream could shatter stone, and whose wings carried her across continents in the span of a single night. She was no less terrible than her elder sister, no less powerful, no less feared throughout the known world and beyond. Her voice alone was a weapon, and she had used it to bring mountains crashing down and to drive armies mad with terror. Warriors who had faced the greatest monsters of the age trembled at the mere mention of her name. Together, the two immortal Gorgons had roamed the edges of the world since before the first human city had risen from the dust. They were forces of nature as much as they were beings, embodiments of the terror that lurked at the boundaries of existence, reminders that the universe contained horrors beyond human understanding. But the third sister was different. Her name was Medusa, and everything about her defied the expectations that her lineage should have established. She alone among the Gorgons had been born mortal. Where her sisters possessed faces of unspeakable horror, she possessed features of extraordinary beauty. Where they inspired only terror, she inspired both awe and desire. This difference would define her existence in ways that neither she nor her sisters could have anticipated. For mortality brings with it vulnerability, and vulnerability attracts those who would exploit it. The gods themselves took notice of this anomaly, this beautiful creature born into a family of monsters, this flower growing in a garden of nightmares. The ancient poets spoke of her loveliness in terms reserved for goddesses and queens. Pindar himself, that master of verse whose words were treasured throughout the Greek world, called her fair-cheeked Medusa. Those who had seen her in the days before her transformation spoke of hair that flowed like rivers of gold, catching the sunlight and transforming it into something even more precious than the metal itself. They spoke of eyes that held the gentleness of dawn breaking over calm seas, of skin so perfect that sculptors wept at their inability to capture it in marble, of a grace and dignity that made even the nymphs weep with envy. Her voice was said to be musical, her laugh like the chiming of silver bells, her every movement a poem written in flesh and motion. Young men traveled from distant lands merely to catch a glimpse of her face. They crossed mountains and seas, risked storms and shipwrecks, endured hunger and hardship, all for the chance to stand in her presence for a single moment. Offerings were left at her door by suitors who dared not speak their desire aloud. Poems were composed in her honor by those who had only heard descriptions of her beauty and could not believe such perfection could exist in mortal form. Kings sent messengers to beg for her hand. Princes abandoned their duties to seek her favor. And yet Medusa remained untouched by mortal hands. She had dedicated her life to something greater than earthly love. She had found her purpose not in the fleeting pleasures of romance, but in the eternal service of the divine. She had turned away from the desires of the flesh and toward the calling of the spirit. She had become a priestess of Athena. The temple of the virgin goddess stood upon a hill overlooking the sea, its marble columns reaching toward the heavens like prayers made solid. The structure had been built generations before Medusa's birth, each stone laid with devotion, each carving executed with reverence, each measurement calculated to honor the goddess who would dwell within. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to worship there, to seek the wisdom of the goddess, to beg for guidance in matters of war and craft and justice. The air within those walls was thick with incense and prayer, with centuries of accumulated holiness that seemed to vibrate in the very stones themselves. Within those sacred walls, Medusa had found her home. She tended the eternal flame that burned before Athena's altar, feeding it with sacred oils and whispering prayers to ensure it never faltered. The flame had burned without interruption since the temple's founding, and it would burn until the last stone crumbled to dust. To tend it was both honor and responsibility, a duty that Medusa performed with unwavering dedication, day after day, year after year, never complaining, never faltering. She swept the floors where countless generations had knelt in supplication, removing every speck of dust that might profane the holy space. She polished the bronze mirrors that hung upon the walls, ensuring that they reflected the goddess's glory without blemish. She arranged the offerings that worshippers left upon the altar, organizing them according to ancient protocols that had been passed down from priestess to priestess since time immemorial. Every task was performed with precision and devotion. She sang the hymns that honored the deity of wisdom, her voice rising pure and clear through the marble halls. The words were in a dialect older than common Greek, a sacred language preserved only within the temple walls. Each syllable carried power, each note was a prayer made manifest. Those who heard her sing wept at the beauty of her voice, though they understood not a single word of the ancient phrases. And she kept her body pure, as the goddess herself demanded. For Athena was a virgin deity, born not from the union of man and woman, but from the head of Zeus himself. According to the myths that every Greek child learned at their mother's knee, Hephaestus had split the king of the gods' skull with an axe, and from that wound Athena had emerged fully formed and fully armed, clad in gleaming armor and bearing a shield that would become legendary. She had never known desire. She had never submitted to the touch of another. Her power came from her independence, her wisdom, her refusal to be defined by relationship to any other being, mortal or divine. Those who served her were required to maintain that same sacred purity, renouncing the pleasures of the flesh in exchange for the honor of standing in her presence. Medusa embraced this calling with complete devotion. She saw in Athena everything she aspired to become: strength without cruelty, wisdom without arrogance, independence without isolation. The goddess needed no husband to define her worth, no children to validate her existence, no lover to complete her being. Athena stood alone among the Olympians as a deity who had forged her own identity through intellect and skill, rather than through the traditional feminine virtues of beauty and motherhood. This was the model Medusa sought to emulate. She rose before dawn each day to begin her duties. She retired long after sunset, exhausted but fulfilled. She spoke her vows of purity not with reluctance, but with joy, seeing in them not a restriction, but a liberation. The desires that plagued other women, the longings that drove them to folly and heartbreak, held no power over her. She belonged to Athena, and that belonging was enough. But the very beauty that Medusa had been born with would become her undoing. It was not enough that she had renounced the pleasures of the flesh. It was not enough that she had devoted every waking moment to the service of her goddess. It was not enough that she had proven her faithfulness through years of sacrifice and dedication. The gods of Olympus did not concern themselves with the desires or boundaries of mortals. They took what they wanted, when they wanted, and those who stood in their path were crushed like insects beneath an indifferent heel. The prayers of the faithful meant nothing when divine desire demanded satisfaction. Poseidon had noticed her. The ruler of the seas, the earth shaker, the tamer of waves and storms, the brother of Zeus himself, had turned his immortal gaze upon the priestess who served his rival. His eyes had found her among the crowds of worshippers, had followed her through the marble halls, had watched her perform her sacred duties with a hunger that had nothing to do with piety. He had seen many beautiful mortals in his eternal existence, had pursued and conquered countless women across the ages, but something about this priestess called to him with particular intensity, and he wanted her. Some said he desired her simply because she was beautiful, and his appetite for beautiful mortals was legendary throughout the Greek world. He had pursued countless women before her, leaving in his wake children and chaos, broken lives and shattered families. Demeter, Amphitrite, and dozens of mortal women had all felt the weight of his attention. He would pursue countless women after her without ever pausing to consider the destruction he caused. For a god, mortal lives were brief as mayflies, their suffering insignificant against the backdrop of eternity. Others whispered different motivations. They said that Poseidon and Athena had quarreled over the patronage of Athens, that great city which would one day become the jewel of Greek civilization. Both deities had wanted the honor of protecting the city, and they had competed to prove their worthiness. Poseidon had struck the ground with his trident and produced a spring of salt water, demonstrating his power over the elements that surrounded the city on nearly every side. Athena had planted an olive tree, symbol of peace and prosperity, demonstrating her concern for the welfare of mortals rather than merely her own power. The citizens had chosen the olive tree, and Athena had won. Poseidon never forgot a slight. His rage was legendary, his grudges eternal. He had destroyed entire fleets for lesser offenses. He had condemned heroes to decades of wandering for a single moment of disrespect. He had drowned cities and swallowed islands for insults that mortals would consider trivial. The loss of Athens burned in him like a wound that would never heal, a humiliation that demanded eventual response. Perhaps his pursuit of Medusa was motivated by desire alone. Perhaps it was an act of revenge against the goddess who had humiliated him. Perhaps it was both, or neither, or something else entirely that no mortal mind could comprehend. The true motivations of the gods were as unfathomable as the depths of the seas themselves. The gods did not explain themselves to humans, they simply acted, and humans suffered the consequences. He came to her on a night when the moon hid its face behind clouds. The darkness was absolute. No stars pierced the overcast sky. No torches burned in the streets outside the temple. The only illumination came from the sacred flame that Medusa had tended since she first took her vows, its flickering light casting dancing shadows upon the marble walls. The shadows seemed alive, writhing and twisting in patterns that suggested faces, forms, futures that would never come to pass. She was alone. The other priestesses had retired to their quarters. The pilgrims had departed for their homes or the inns where they would spend the night. The guards who sometimes patrolled the outer halls had been called away to deal with some disturbance in the city below. The temple belonged to Medusa and to the goddess she served, and in that solitude she performed the evening rituals that she had completed 1,000 times before. She checked the oil in the sacred lamps. She arranged the offerings that worshippers had left upon the altar. She whispered the prayers of closing that would seal the temple until dawn. Her voice was soft in the silence, her movements practiced and precise, her devotion unwavering. And then the air changed. It grew thick with the smell of salt and seaweed, of deep water and drowned things. The temperature dropped until Medusa could see her own breath misting before her face. The sacred flame wavered. Though no wind had entered the sealed building, the shadows on the walls seemed to deepen and stretch, reaching toward her like grasping hands. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. She turned. He stood in the doorway of the inner sanctum, a figure of immense power that seemed to fill the entire space despite the vastness of the architecture around him. His hair was the dark green of deep ocean trenches where no light had ever penetrated. His beard flowed like currents across his chest. His eyes burned with a light that had nothing to do with warmth, the cold luminescence of creatures that dwelt where sunlight never reached. In his hand, he held his trident, that weapon which had split mountains and swallowed islands, which had stirred the seas into fury and calmed them to glass. Medusa recognized him immediately. Every Greek knew the face of Poseidon, for his image adorned temples and coins throughout the land. Sailors prayed to him before every voyage, offering sacrifices for safe passage and calm waters. Cities built upon the shore offered greater sacrifices to placate his wrath, for his anger could sweep away entire populations in a single night. His power was second only to Zeus himself, and his temper was legendary for its violence and unpredictability. She fell to her knees, not in worship, not in welcome, not in submission, in terror, for she understood in that moment exactly why he had come. She had seen that look before, on the faces of mortal men who had tried to pursue her despite her vows. But mortal men could be refused. Mortal men could be turned away. Mortal men could be reported to the authorities or threatened with the wrath of the goddess. A god was different. A god could not be denied. She begged him to leave. Her words tumbled over each other in her desperation. Arguments and pleas and prayers mingling into a stream of sound that she hoped might somehow reach him. She invoked the name of Athena, reminding him that this was sacred ground, that the temple was inviolate, that even the gods respected the sanctity of holy places. She reminded him of her vows, her dedication, her status as a servant of the virgin goddess. She told him she was under Athena's protection. His laughter echoed through the temple like thunder over the sea. Protection. The word seemed to amuse him. He spoke of protection as if it were a jest, a pretty fiction that mortals told themselves to feel safe in an unsafe world. Athena could not protect her servants from him. Athena could not even protect herself from him, if he chose to challenge her. The gods of Olympus maintained their peace through carefully negotiated truces, not through any genuine power to restrain one another. He took a step forward. Medusa scrambled backward, her robes tangling around her legs, her hands scraping against the cold marble floor. She called out for help, but the temple was empty. She prayed to Athena, but the goddess did not appear. She screamed into the darkness, but the darkness swallowed her voice and gave nothing back. No one answered. No one came. The violation that followed would never be described in detail by the ancient poets. Some horrors transcend the capacity of language to express. Some suffering exists beyond the reach of words, in a realm where only silence can speak truthfully. What the sources record is simply this. Poseidon took what he wanted upon the very altar where Medusa had spent years offering sacrifices to Athena. He committed his crime in the heart of his rival's sacred space, defiling not only the priestess, but the goddess herself, transforming the most holy ground in the temple into a monument to his own power and contempt. The sacred flame continued to burn throughout. It witnessed everything. It illuminated everything. And it offered no protection, no intervention, no miracle of divine rescue. When it was over, he left. He walked out of the temple and vanished into the night, returning to his palace beneath the waves, to his queen Amphitrite, who waited on her coral throne, to his dominion over the endless seas, where his word was law, and his will was absolute. For Poseidon, the incident was barely worthy of memory. He had committed such acts countless times before, and would commit them countless times again. The mortal woman he had destroyed meant nothing to him. She was not even important enough to remember. But for Medusa, everything had changed. She lay upon the cold stone of the altar, her white robes torn and stained with evidence of her violation, her body broken in ways that would never fully heal. The sacred flame still burned above her, its light now seeming to mock rather than comfort. The statue of Athena still gazed down from its pedestal, those carved stone eyes appearing to judge her for a crime she had not committed. And Medusa wept. She wept for her violated flesh, for the purity she had guarded so carefully and lost so brutally. She wept for her shattered vows, for the promises she had made to her goddess and could never keep again. She wept for the life she had built within these walls, the identity she had crafted through years of service and sacrifice, now destroyed in a single night by a force she could not have anticipated or prevented. She wept until no more tears would come. Then she simply lay in silence, waiting for death or dawn, whichever arrived first. Dawn came, and with it came something far worse than death. The air in the temple shifted once again, but this time the presence that filled the sacred space was not that of a lustful god seeking pleasure. It was something colder, something harder, something that burned with a fury that made the eternal flame seem pale and insignificant by comparison. Athena had arrived, The goddess of wisdom materialized before her violated altar, and her grey eyes, keen as a hawk's, took in every detail of the desecration that had occurred. She saw the torn robes scattered across the floor. She saw the overturned offerings and extinguished lamps. She saw the scattered remnants of the sacred objects that had been knocked aside during the struggle. And she saw her priestess lying broken upon the stone, where only purity should have dwelt. The goddess felt rage, but Athena's rage was not directed at Poseidon. To punish the god of the seas would mean war among the Olympians. It would mean choosing sides between powers far greater than any single deity could overcome alone. It would mean consequences that could reshape the cosmos itself, unleashing forces that had been carefully contained since the defeat of the Titans. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, and wisdom dictated that some enemies were too powerful to challenge directly, but someone had to be punished. The temple had been defiled, the sacred precinct had been violated, the honor of the goddess had been insulted. These offenses demanded response. The priestess was another matter entirely. Medusa heard the sound of divine footsteps approaching and forced herself to rise. Every movement sent agony through her body, but she had to face her goddess. She had to explain what had happened. She had to make Athena understand. She looked up at her goddess with eyes full of desperate hope. Surely Athena would understand. The goddess of wisdom, of justice, of strategic thinking. Surely she would see the truth of the situation. Surely she would recognize that her faithful servant had been violated, not seduced. Surely she would understand that the crime had been committed by Poseidon, not by the woman he had attacked. She was wrong. Athena spoke, and her voice was like ice cracking over a frozen lake, like steel scraping against stone, like the final breath of hope dying in the darkness. She pronounced no trial. She offered no opportunity for defense. She asked no questions about what had occurred or why. She simply declared her judgment, and in that judgment, Medusa heard the true nature of divine justice. The temple had been defiled. Someone had to pay. And it would not be Poseidon. The goddess raised her hand, fingers spread wide, and spoke words in a language older than human speech. The air around Medusa began to shimmer and twist. Reality itself seemed to bend under the force of divine will. And Medusa felt her body begin to change. It started with her hair. Those golden locks that had inspired poetry and song, that had flowed like rivers of light across her shoulders, began to twist and writhe. Individual strands thickened and elongated, developing scales that gleamed darkly in the firelight. Eyes appeared where there should have been none, small and malevolent, glittering with an intelligence that was not human. Fangs emerged from mouths that formed where no mouths belonged. Her beautiful hair was becoming a crown of living nightmares. Medusa screamed as she felt them moving, felt their weight upon her scalp, felt their cold bodies brushing against her neck and shoulders. She reached up to tear them away, but they hissed and snapped at her hands, their fangs drawing blood from her fingers. They were part of her now. They would be part of her until the day she died. But the transformation was not complete. Her face remained beautiful. The features that had launched 1,000 desires remained unchanged. But now that beauty was weaponized, now it was trap rather than gift. Athena had granted her a new power. Anyone who looked upon her face would be turned instantly to stone. Her gaze, once gentle and inviting, had become the most lethal weapon in existence. The goddess smiled at her work. Medusa fled. She ran from the temple that had been her home. She ran until the sea spread out before her like an endless accusation. She ran until her legs could carry her no further. But madness did not come. Instead, something worse arrived. Clarity. The full comprehension of what had been done to her and why. She had been punished not for her sins, but for the sins of another. She was alone. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Medusa wandered the edges of the known world. She learned quickly that her gaze could not be controlled. The first mortal she encountered was a shepherd who had simply been looking for lost animals. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He turned to stone. She tried wrapping cloth around her eyes. She tried living only at night. She tried isolating herself completely. Eventually, she found her sisters. Steno and Euryale welcomed her without hesitation. The Gorgons would be free once more. They made their home on an island at the western edge of the world. Here, Medusa spent decades, surrounded by stone figures frozen in expressions of terror, and the gods observed. If this story is holding you captive, subscribe now and activate the notification bell. Here, every narrative is a journey through the myths that shaped civilizations. And what comes next in the story of Medusa will reveal how even in death, her tragedy would birth something that transcended the cruelty of her existence. High above the mortal realm, upon the peaks of Mount Olympus, the deities pursued their endless games of power and passion. Zeus, king of the gods, had turned his attention to a new object of desire. Her name was Danae, and she was the daughter of King Acrisius of Argos. Acrisius had received a prophecy. The oracle at Delphi had declared that he would never have a son of his own, but his daughter would bear a grandson who would one day kill him. Terrified by this prediction, the king locked Danae away in a chamber of bronze buried deep beneath the earth, determined to prevent any man from reaching her. But no prison built by mortal hands could keep out the ruler of the heavens. Zeus transformed himself into a shower of golden light and streamed through the cracks in the bronze chamber, cascading down upon Danae like liquid sunlight. 9 months later, Danae gave birth to a son. She named him Perseus. Acrisius discovered the child and faced an impossible choice. He could not kill his own grandson, for the Furies punished such crimes with eternal torment. But he could not allow the boy to live near him. So the king placed Danae and the infant in a wooden chest and cast them out upon the open sea. The chest floated for days across wine-dark waters. Inside, Danae held her baby close and sang songs of hope into the endless darkness. She did not know that Zeus was watching from above, guiding the currents, calming the waves. All she knew was that against all odds, she and her son survived. The chest washed ashore on the island of Seriphos. A fisherman named Dictys discovered it tangled in his nets and broke it open to find the woman and child within. He took them into his home and raised Perseus as if the boy were his own son. For years, they lived in peace on that small island, far from the politics of kings and the machinations of gods. But peace could not last forever. Dictys had a brother named Polydectes, and Polydectes was the king of Seriphos. When the king laid eyes upon Danae, he wanted her with an obsession that bordered on madness. She refused his advances. She had already been taken against her will once. She would not willingly submit to a mortal king. Her refusal only inflamed his desire. Polydectes realized that as long as Perseus lived, he would protect his mother. The young man had grown into a warrior of exceptional skill and courage, and he had made clear that he would die before allowing anyone to harm Danae. So the king devised a plan to remove Perseus permanently. He demanded that every man on the island bring him a wedding gift worthy of a king. When Perseus arrived at the gathering without a suitable offering, Polydectes pretended to be offended. Perseus, stung by the public humiliation, made a rash promise. He declared that he would bring Polydectes any gift he desired, no matter how difficult to obtain. The king smiled. "Bring me the head of Medusa," he said. The words echoed through the hall like a death sentence. Every man present knew the legends of the Gorgon. They knew that her gaze turned living flesh to stone, that her island was littered with the petrified corpses of warriors far greater than this fisherman's son. To seek Medusa was to seek death. But Perseus had given his word. He departed that very night. He had no idea where to find the Gorgons. He had no weapons capable of harming an immortal creature. He had nothing but his courage and his determination, but the gods had not forgotten him. Athena appeared to Perseus as he walked along the shore, contemplating his impossible quest. The goddess of wisdom recognized an opportunity in the young hero's desperation. She still harbored resentment toward Medusa, not for any crime the Gorgon had committed, but simply for existing as a reminder of the violation of her temple. If Perseus could destroy Medusa, he would be doing the goddess a service. She offered him guidance. First, he must find the three Grey sisters who shared a single eye. Only they knew the location of certain nymphs who possessed the tools he would need for his quest. Then she gave him a gift of her own, a polished bronze shield so highly reflective that it could serve as a mirror. "You must never look directly at the Gorgon," she warned. "Use the shield to see her reflection and strike while her gaze is turned away." Hermes arrived next, the messenger of the gods, swift as thought and cunning as necessity. He brought Perseus a sword of adamantine, the hardest substance in existence, capable of cutting through any material, including the flesh of monsters. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus began his journey. The Grey dwelt in a land of perpetual twilight, where the sun never fully rose and the stars never fully emerged. Perseus found them sitting in a circle, passing their single eye from hand to withered hand, each sister taking her turn to gaze upon the grey world around them. He watched from the shadows and waited for his moment. When the eye passed from one sister to another, there was an instant when none of them could see. Perseus lunged forward and snatched the eye from the air. The Grey screamed in fury and confusion. They demanded the return of their precious eye. They threatened curses beyond mortal imagination, but Perseus remained calm. He would return the eye, he said, but only if they told him the location of the nymphs who possessed the items he needed. The sisters had no choice. They revealed the path to the hidden realm where certain nymphs guarded 3 sacred objects: winged sandals that allowed the wearer to fly, a cap of invisibility forged by Hades himself, and a magical bag called the Kibisis that could safely contain any object no matter how dangerous. Perseus found the nymphs and persuaded them to lend him their treasures. With the winged sandals upon his feet, he soared through the clouds like a god. With the cap of Hades upon his head, he became invisible to all eyes, and with the Kibisis slung across his shoulder, he had a means to carry the Gorgon's head without touching its deadly visage. He flew west toward the edge of the world. The journey took him across lands no Greek had ever seen and waters no Greek ship had ever crossed. He passed over deserts where the sand burned hotter than fire and mountains where the snow never melted. He saw creatures that had no names in any human language and civilizations that had risen and fallen before the first stone was laid in Athens. And finally, he saw the island. It rose from the sea like a warning, its cliffs black and jagged, its shores strewn with boulders that on closer inspection revealed themselves to be statues. Hundreds of them, thousands, men of every nation and every era, frozen in their final moments of terror, reaching toward heavens that had offered no salvation. Perseus landed on the far side of the island and approached on foot with Athena's shield held before him like a lantern in darkness. He moved slowly, checking every shadow, never allowing his eyes to focus on anything except the polished bronze surface. The creatures upon Medusa's head sensed him first. They began to hiss, a sound like water droplets falling on hot metal, rising in volume and intensity as he drew closer. Perseus heard them and understood that his quarry was near. He adjusted his grip on the adamantine sword and continued forward. He found her in a cave at the center of the island. She was sleeping. In the reflection of his shield, Perseus could see her clearly for the first time. The creatures upon her head were coiled and quiet now, their eyes closed, their forked tongues still. Her face was turned toward the cave ceiling, peaceful in repose, and even in that distorted reflection, he could see traces of the beauty that had once driven men to madness. Her sisters slept beside her. Steno and Euryale were immortal, and no weapon Perseus possessed could harm them. But Medusa was mortal. Medusa could die, and in that mortality lay both her vulnerability and her tragedy. Perseus crept closer. His sandals made no sound upon the stone floor. His invisible form cast no shadow that might alert the sleeping Gorgons. He raised the adamantine sword above his head and angled it carefully, judging the distance between his arm and her neck. One strike. That was all he would get. He brought the blade down. The sword sang through the air and connected with flesh. There was a moment of resistance, then a yielding, then a terrible sound, like nothing Perseus had ever heard. Medusa's eyes flew open in that final instant. Her mouth opened in a scream that never emerged, and then her head separated from her body and tumbled to the cave floor. The creatures upon her scalp continued to writhe. Blood poured from the wound, but it was not ordinary blood. From that crimson stream emerged two forms that defied all natural law. The first was a winged creature of impossible beauty, white as fresh snow, rising from the gore like a dream made manifest. This was Pegasus, the divine offspring that Medusa had carried within her since the night of her violation. The second was a giant, golden and terrible, wielding a sword that blazed with inner light. This was Chrysaor, brother to Pegasus, another child of Poseidon that had waited within Medusa's cursed body for liberation. Both creatures burst from the cave and vanished into the sky. But Perseus had no time to wonder at these miracles. The commotion had awakened Steno and Euryale. The immortal Gorgons rose from their slumber and saw their sister's headless body lying upon the stone. They saw the blood still flowing from the wound. They saw the evidence of murder committed while they slept, and they screamed. The sound shook the island to its foundations. Rocks tumbled from the cave ceiling. The sea itself seemed to recoil from the intensity of their grief and rage. They spread their golden wings and launched themselves into the air, searching for the killer who had taken their sister from them. But Perseus was invisible. He stood mere feet from them, holding the kibyssus into which he had thrust Medusa's head, and they could not see him. They flew in widening circles around the island, howling their fury to uncaring heavens, while the murderer of their sister simply walked to the shore and took flight on his winged sandals. He had done the impossible. He had slain the Gorgon Medusa and escaped with her head. The journey home brought more adventures. He petrified the Titan Atlas, transforming him into the mountain range that still bears his name. He rescued the Princess Andromeda from a sea creature sent by Poseidon, fighting it with blade and cunning until the monster sank beneath the crimson waves. He married Andromeda after defeating her former betrothed Phineus by raising Medusa's head and transforming 200 warriors to stone in a heartbeat. They arrived in Seriphos to find that Polydectes had resumed his pursuit of Danae. She had fled to a temple for sanctuary. Perseus went directly to the palace. Polydectes was hosting a feast when the young hero strode into the hall. The king looked up in shock and then disbelief. The fisherman's son had returned. The impossible quest had been completed. "You asked for a gift," Perseus said. "I have brought it." He reached into the kibyssus. Polydectes had just enough time to understand what was happening before the head of Medusa emerged from the bag. The king's final expression was one of terror. Then his flesh became stone, and the tyrant of Seriphos was no more. His courtiers suffered the same fate. Perseus gave the throne to Dictys. The fisherman who had saved a mother and child from the sea now became king. Perseus returned the divine artifacts to their owners, and the head of Medusa, that terrible trophy that had served him so well, he gave to Athena. The goddess accepted it with satisfaction. She set the Gorgon's face upon her aegis, the sacred breastplate that she wore into battle. From that day forward, the image of Medusa would serve the very deity who had cursed her. Even in death, Medusa served those who had destroyed her. Perseus traveled to Argos to reconcile with his grandfather, Acrisius. But Acrisius had heard of his grandson's return. The prophecy still echoed in his memory. Rather than face Perseus, he fled to Larissa, hoping to hide from the fate that pursued him. It followed him anyway. Perseus also traveled to Larissa, though by coincidence rather than design. The king of that city was holding athletic games, and Perseus decided to participate. The discus throw was his finest event. He took his position, felt the weight of the disc in his hand, and hurled it with all the strength his divine heritage had granted him. The discus soared through the air, and then something went wrong. A gust of wind caught the disc and carried it off course. It veered toward the spectators, toward one old man who had been watching from what he believed was a safe distance. Acrisius died instantly. The prophecy was fulfilled. Perseus had killed his grandfather, not through malice or intent, but through the blind mechanics of fate. The very act of trying to escape the oracle had led Acrisius to the place where he would meet his end. The hero buried his grandfather with appropriate honors. He did not take the throne of Argos. Instead, he founded the great city of Mycenae and ruled wisely for many years. Andromeda bore him many children, and through them his bloodline extended down through the ages. His great-grandson would be Heracles, the greatest hero Greece would ever know. But what of Medusa? Her story ended in that cave, but its echoes continued long after her death. The drops of blood that fell from her severed head as Perseus flew over Libya became poisonous creatures that would haunt that land forever. The coral of the Red Sea was said to have formed from her blood-touching seaweed. Her children, Pegasus and Chrysaor, went on to have their own legends, their own triumphs and tragedies, and her face remained. Upon Athena's aegis, upon countless shields and temples, upon coins and mosaics and works of art spanning millennia, the image of Medusa endured. She became a symbol of protection and terror, of beauty and horror, of the thin line between victim and monster. The Greeks understood something the modern world has chosen to forget, that justice is not equal, that the powerful write history and the broken become its villains. Medusa asked for nothing. She served her goddess with devotion. She walked the sacred halls with purity, and yet she was the one transformed, the one exiled, the one hunted. Poseidon returned to his throne beneath the waves. Athena continued to receive worship and offerings, but Medusa wandered alone, petrifying all who dared approach, until a sword ended what the gods had already killed. Her fate was never about punishment. It was about silence. For if the victim becomes the monster, no one needs to speak of the crime. If this story touched you, write in the comments, "I see her truth now."